David, God is all powerful, all knowing, all free, all good. I'm told that God knows the future. How is that possible?
There's a lot I don't know about God. And I prefer to be agnostic on that. One can come up with models, but that could just be blowing hot air. One of my favorites is to think of God as though he's equipped with a sort of time telescope. So just as an ordinary telescope allows one to see what is spatially distant, a time telescope would allow one to see what is temporally distant. God anticipates the future in a kind of reverse of how one remembers the past.
Well, the word anticipates is an interesting word, which indicates sort of a probabilistic. God knows all things, how they're going to work, and all the probabilities of quantum mechanics and our brains and whatever it is, whatever we got, and he knows, she knows, and therefore can estimate maybe not 99.99%, but can God know 100%? Can God know everything that will ever happen, down to the last movement of the last atom?
Right. That's the advantage of the time telescope. If God had to predict the future based on his exhaustive knowledge of the present, then he could know the future exhaustively only if we lived in a deterministic world.
So which way do you believe it?
I like the time telescope analogy simply because I don't want a conception of divine foreknowledge that presupposes that the world is deterministic. I think if there are future contingencies, God, being omniscient, would have to know them, because I think that there are truths now, truths of the matter, about how things will go.
So, because God must know everything, omniscient, and there are statements today we can make about the future, what you're saying that God is then required to know the present statements about the future, and therefore God has to know the future.
Exactly.
Are you holding God to a standard that is logically impossible? Because if the future is open in some way, then perhaps not even God can know that, and it's no slight on God's omniscience to know something today that doesn't exist today.
Exactly, and that's the position of many open theists who deny that God knows future contingents, but who hold that he's nevertheless omniscient, because there are no truths corresponding to those future contingents. He still knows all truths. I hold, rather naively, I think, but I think agreeing with most people's intuitions or initial intuitions, that if I were to raise my right hand now, if you had said a minute ago that I will raise my right hand at that point, you would have been right. Now, it'd be a mystery how you could have known that. It may have been a sheer guess, presumably, but nevertheless, what you said then was true. Many people raise difficulties with that, basically on the ground that a statement is true if it corresponds to reality. But the nature of the future is that it isn't yet real. Hence, there's nothing in reality to correspond to that statement. I think that's to misconstrue the nature of propositions about the future. Proposition about the future is about how things will be. So if that statement is true, what corresponds to that statement, what makes it true, has to be something in the future, not something that presently obtains.
So you're requiring God to know every possible contingent thing in the future, the shape of every atom at every point in any...
Because I believe there are truths corresponding to all those things.
And for the God that you believe in to be truly omniscient has to know that.
Exactly.
And so you have to figure out, you may not know, but you're requiring God to know all of those things for the future.
Right.
So the next question comes up is that how then can we be free and held morally accountable for what we do?
That's a really interesting and ancient problem. First, raised probably by St. Augustine, or there are some pagan antecedents of that in the Stoics. It's a really interesting problem. It's one that you don't need a numbered proof to understand.
Yeah.
You can just picture it. So here I come to a fork in life's road. Seems to me I can go left or right. I'm going to go one way or the other. Let's suppose I go left. Before I was even born, God knew that I would go left at that fork in the road. So here I'm born, I come into existence with an infallible foreknower, already knowing which direction I'm going to go when I come to that fork in the road. Now let's fast forward to that fork. Here I am, left or right. It seems to me they're both open. But can I really go right? That would be to falsify a belief held before I was even born by an infallibly omniscient being. It seems that that's logically impossible. Surely I don't have the power to do that. So it does look like I can only go left. That's the problem.
Which means you have no free will, which means, well, how can you be held accountable?
Right.
How can I send you to hell for doing something you couldn't have otherwise done?
Exactly.
You got a problem with your God.
Got a problem. It's an interesting problem.
Well, more than that, it affects a lot. Go ahead.
I think the first question you might want to raise is, what kind of problem is it? There's different kinds of problems. And let me illustrate that by comparing this problem with another famous problem, Zeno's paradoxes of motion. The famous Achilles paradox, where Zeno attempts to show that if Achilles, the fleetest of the Achaeans, gives a tortoise a head start, Achilles can't pass the tortoise. And he's got a very clever argument for this. It's very difficult to pinpoint exactly where the argument goes wrong. Now, what kind of problem does that pose for someone who hears the argument? Oh, man, I didn't realize that. Faster things maybe don't pass slower things. I better examine this argument pretty carefully, because that's a pretty weighty conclusion. That's going to cause me to revise a lot of my beliefs about the world. No. In fact, no one believes that that conclusion is right. Everyone believes there's something wrong with that argument. And so the sort of problem that argument raises for us is really a puzzle. Where did the argument go wrong? It's got to go wrong somewhere. Secondly, it's not really a problem for Achilles. You might think it's a problem for Achilles, and if you think that's the nature of the problem, then you can get out of it easily. You can say, oh, maybe Homer was wrong about Achilles. Maybe he was a cripple, lame. And in fact, he couldn't pass a tortoise, right? Does that solve the problem? No. You just get rid of Achilles and you bring in Rafer Johnson, or me even, right? So it's not an Achilles problem. Achilles is just a character, a fictional character that helps us raise the problem. Let's turn back to the problem of foreknowledge, because obviously we're talking about Achilles because it must be relevant somehow to the foreknowledge problem. I rather think that the foreknowledge problem is like the Achilles problem in both of those respects. I think, first of all, it isn't essentially a problem about God. You can get out of the foreknowledge problem by revising the way you think about God, just as we could get out of Zeno's paradox by revising what we thought about Achilles. Maybe he's lame or a cripple, right? Here, one famous way you can get out of the foreknowledge problem is to say, well, God doesn't exist in time. He exists outside of time. That was Boethius's view. That's a view I'm, in fact, very attracted to. That's the kind of God I do believe in. It's more metaphysically exciting sort of God. But I don't think that's the right way to escape the foreknowledge problem. Some have suggested you can get out of the problem by denying that God literally foreknows the future, because God isn't in time. He's outside of time. I think that's a very attractive way of thinking about God, but I don't think it solves his problem any more than revising Achilles' attributes solves Zeno's paradox. It removes God from complicity in the problem, but we can restate the problem by introducing some fictional character, Glumph, who is an infallible foreknower. And suppose Glumph knew before you came into existence that you would go left at that fork in the road. you still have a problem. It's a thought experiment problem, no longer a theological problem. Why think that's a real problem to worry about? Why think it poses a serious philosophical puzzle? Well, here's why. Take your paradigm of free agency. Imagine a case of free agency that satisfies your favorite criteria for what it is to act freely. And if free will exists at all, this is an example of it. And now let's add one thing to the picture. Before you were born, somebody knew infallibly what you were going to do. Strikes me as very bizarre that that should make any difference to the various features of your action that qualified it as free. This foreknower doesn't interfere with what you do. You don't do what you do because it was foreknown. Everything seems to happen exactly as it did before, except there's this foreknower around.
Except I could not have done otherwise.
Exactly. That's the only difference it makes. It means that you couldn't go to the right at that fork in the road. Here's what I think the moral is, that the alternative possibility condition on free will and moral responsibility we've thought has been the key condition on moral responsibility all the way back to Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. That's not so important. One can be free even if one has no alternatives. That the key thing to free will is sourcehood of the right sort, that I'm the author of my action in the right kind of way. And of course, that would have to be spelled out. It might be quite complicated. But the idea that I must be able to do otherwise in order to be morally responsible, that seems to fall by the wayside.